And I am really delighted to have this be my first kind of soup to nuts event that I'm organizing as part of my new role here at DGAP. Of course, this is very meaningful for me because I'm an American working on tech policy in Berlin and have worked in the US government in the past, in the Obama administration. And I'm quite excited to hear about what is on the agenda on transatlantic tech, what should be on the agenda on transatlantic tech, and of course, what are going to be the challenges, both coming out of this administration and more broadly, the systemic challenges that we're facing as the geopolitical and transatlantic landscape have definitely evolved in the past, say, 4 years. So I want to go ahead and start, before I introduce our speakers, with a quote from the vice president himself, when he was vice president, before he was president-elect, from July 2019. He said, he was giving a speech at CUNY, which is a university in New York, and he said, "Tech companies which benefit from the fruits of democracy should take concrete pledges for how they can ensure their algorithms and platforms are not empowering the surveillance state, creating repression in China and elsewhere, spreading hate, spurring people to violence, and remaining susceptible to misuse." So clearly, it's a different tone that we're hearing from President-elect Biden than we would have heard in the Obama administration. And of course, it's very different from what we're hearing from the Trump administration. There are a lot of issues on the table, from emerging tech to data protection and privacy, to the digital services tax, to intermediary liability exemptions, platform regulation, cloud computing, and of course, the big question on everybody's mind geopolitically and also in the tech space is China. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think we're going to have a great one. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Kerry. He is a distinguished fellow, distinguished visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a former senior official at the Department of Commerce under the Obama administration, including, I believe, acting Secretary of Commerce for a point. Another speaker from Berlin, but often in Brussels, is Sergey Lagodinsky. He is a member of the European Parliament in his first term in office, representing the Green Party, representing Germany for the Green Party. He is also the vice chair of the Legal Affairs Committee and is working a lot on tech issues, particularly around artificial intelligence. But in a past life, he was also a think tanker like myself and worked at the Bose Foundation on transatlantic relations. So welcome, Sergey. Our third speaker is Diane Rinaldo. She is the Senior Vice President at Beacon Global Strategies, which is an organization in Washington that basically knows what things are happening, when things are happening, what regulations are in the works, what the political dynamic is in the city. And she has a lot of legitimacy to do that, given her past in the Trump administration at the Department of Commerce, and prior to that as a longtime Hill staffer for the Republicans, particularly working on the Select Committee on Intelligence in the House of Representatives. And our final speaker is Erich Clementi, who is a European American, has his eye on both continents, and I think has a pretty good understanding of both. He is the deputy chair of the supervisory board at Aon and former chairman of IBM Europe, and is a Südtiroler, which I always just love that region, not only because it's beautiful, but because it's the perfect mix, I think, of the best of Italy and let's say Northern Europe, the German-speaking world. So welcome, Erich, to this round as well. So let me start off. We're going to have a couple of rounds of questions from me, discussion with the group, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So if you have a question, just raise your blue hand, and we prefer that you ask your question yourself. So let me start with a question for Cam. I'm going to give you the big question. What do you think are the most pressing issues on Biden's tech agenda with Europe? And how do you think this is going to differ from the Trump administration?
Well, thanks, Tyson, and it's good to be here. We've seen over the last day the news of some of the cabinet and national security appointments, with Tony Blinken at Secretary of State and Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, among other positions. And I think that confirms what's, I think, been very clear about Joe Biden's approach to the transatlantic relationship generally. That, a real commitment to the alliances, to rebuilding that relationship. And as Tony Blinken said at some comments last July, Europe remains a partner of first resort, not last resort, when it comes to contending with the challenges we face. And I think certainly some of those challenges are in the digital arena. The quote that you read from Joe Biden reflects, I think, some views and concerns that are more aligned with Europe than in the past. And I think that's, there are bipartisan concerns there as well. I mean, certainly the issues of tech competition are things that I think we see on both sides of the Atlantic. And there will be, there's developing stepped up enforcement in that area. And I think we will see an effort at transatlantic cooperation there. There also are challenges in the relationship. I mean, President von der Leyen gave a speech on Friday to the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations that broached key elements of a new transatlantic relationship and put digital issues near the top of that agenda. That includes certainly the challenges of working out data flows post-Schrems. She mentioned an issue that I've been working on at Brookings, which is cooperation in artificial intelligence policy. And I think, we have seen across the Trump administration, I think, some increasing recognition, despite the hostility to multilateral organizations, despite Trump's NATO appearance in 2011, or Mike Pompeo's speech to the European Parliament about a year later. I think some grudging recognition of the value of multilateral institutions and working with Europe through a variety of mechanisms, the global partnership on artificial intelligence that this administration joined. And I think, there include Diane Rinaldo and her agency, NTIA, in this. There have been parts of the administration that sort of, despite the rhetoric, have been working cooperatively. I think we will see that that increase in the Biden administration in some of these areas. But I think the first priority is going to be the issues of data flows. That needs to be worked out soon.
Thank you so much, Kim. I think you set it up right. Competition, AI, but the first thing we got to get right is data. And, it's in a precarious position right now. We've got about, we're headed into really choppy waters with standard contractual clauses, a lot of challenges. Diane, you're a veteran of these issues at the Department of Commerce. Where do you see common ground for data flows and an agreement between, a durable agreement between the US and Europe post Schrems II? Are you optimistic about this space?
I am optimistic because I believe that we need to get there. I think it's so important, first and foremost, that we have trust between the United States and the EU. And I think setting the tone as we move into 2021, a new administration, properly filling out the administration. Under the Trump administration, we had an EU ambassador for only a short period of time. So I think it's important to get the right people in these jobs to start having these conversations. And I will ask Cam to please fill in where I miss, because he is the most thoughtful mind in Washington on these issues. So I will say, I think it's important. And I think where the US has lacked is education and sharing of information. You saw that the administration released a white paper 2 months ago in September that outlined the work that are between the United States and the EU, the information sharing that occurs, and how surveillance programs do help the European Union thwart terrorist attacks, other attacks, cyber. So it's important to continue to have these conversations, build the trust. Again, there are no greater allies in this world than the United States and the European Union. We need to continue to ensure that we are working these issues between the two, but as well as looking forward to the future and how we can strengthen our own economies, how we can strengthen the Union as well as the United States in moving forward. It's incredibly important.
I'm going to go to Erich in a second with a big question, but I want to go to Cam right now because
all right,
you are called on, and I want to push you a little bit. What are how can we make some concrete differences to address the issues raised in the ECJ's decision in Schrems II? They pointed out some pretty specific issues regarding redress and proportionality. Is there anything that the United States can really do here? And what is the US expectation of the Commission, that they understand how their own legislative, executive, judicial dynamic works, that they can negotiate credibly?
Yeah. So, well, thanks. Look, I'm encouraged by the sort of constructive tone on both sides, and neither has overreacted, and I think there was the potential for this issue to sort of become a real rupture. But this is a key relationship, a key economic, strategic relationship, and I think there is a very strong political commitment on both sides to make this work. I think there is an effort to try to come up with an administrative solution that can provide more robust, independent review of redress or access and rectification claims from Europeans, and that there may be ways to create out of that judicial redress. I think it's also important to increase the disclosure. I mean, there has been a radical transformation of sort of the paradigm of how we deal with international intelligence following the Snowden revelations and Presidential Policy Directive 28. That has really transformed the way that the international norms in this area. The U.S. has been a leader in that regard. And I don't, ultimately, I think the CJU didn't really fully recognize how those changes have been implemented in U.S. practices. So I think what we need to do is to make those practices clearer. Ultimately, that may take legislation to codify the changes that have been made at the administrative level, to put them into legislation that makes very clear to all the world and to the Court of Justice how America treats foreign citizens and the safeguards that it puts around its surveillance.
Erich, we've been talking a little bit just now about the perennial issue. It's kind of it's the present at the creation issue in transatlantic tech policy, which is data protection and privacy. But in the interim, you know, the tech relationship has become a lot more. There's hardware issues, there are export control issues, there's geopolitics, there's competition, there's everything under the sun. And one of the big kind of, let's say, bumper stickers that the EU has put on this, its strategy towards tech policy has been the issue of, or the pursuit of, digital sovereignty. What do you make of this pursuit of digital sovereignty? What does this mean? And what does it mean, particularly in the transatlantic context, when you have Germany, obviously a key state, basically heading into an election cycle at the start of 2021?
Yeah. So I've been on this fault line for most of my career, operating a large US tech company on both sides of the Atlantic. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been an acceleration in the urgency of these problems. Digital sovereignty, as defined by Macron just in his latest large interview that he gave, I think, last week, has to be seen against a context. And the context, if I may, is as follows. First, we are seeing a war around technology standards. So there is the risk of a decoupling between what used to be a homogeneous internet into a Chinese and a Western part first. Second, you have to see this in the context of strategic autonomy. And I think that's equally felt in Germany as it is in France, the extraterritorial nature of some of the actions that have been set around sanctions are difficult from a political point of view to swallow. Okay, so then if you have this context of what is the strategic autonomy, then let's look at digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty, as Cam and Diane already said, first rests on certainty around how we deal with data. Because if there is no consensus there and no cooperation there, I think transatlantic economic activity will be impacted. Then there is a more economic aspect in this digital sovereignty where Europe finds itself in a catch-up position. If we're honest, digital technology is dominated by US companies. There is you can pick the layer, whether the layer is cloud, whether the layer is fabrication, whether the layer is chip technology. The US is in the lead. And what that means for Europe is, as industries digitize, Europe wants to assert control over its destiny. And I think with the Biden administration coming in, there is the opportunity for cooperation which can benefit both sides enormously. The advantage of the EU and the US is the largest, combined, it's the largest market in the world. It's the market that can set standards, okay? But if inside this market, there is not a commonality or a common understanding of how we deal with each other, then it will get contentious. Frankly, from my point of view, there is no scenario in which I could imagine an economically viable third European way alongside the Chinese and the US from an economic point of view. So having said that, it makes more and more sense for me to see the two continents pulled together. Now, there's a German election coming in, and if you follow carefully, Europe is going to release the Digital Services Act. It has put out drafts of data governance. It has started talking about gatekeeper platforms. So there is a set of regulations, of laws, and on the other hand, competitive or anti-competitive action, however you wanna phrase it. So this is the context. I do see from everything I read about the German reaction, a complete alignment in principle with the French side. I don't think elections are going to alter that. You have seen Germany take the lead in common projects like Gaia-X. You have seen Germany starting to talk about what I would call data commons for the mobility industry. So there's legislation underway that says that government data are a common good and should be put into common usage. So I would say, if you allow the term, Tyson, the plumbing is being laid out. The plumbing is being laid out. To me, coming from the industry, the question is, how do the US and Europe do this without splitting the market? And second, making it economically viable. You see, we have an example in history where the former Soviet Union went into a technology race against the US. It ended up with Soyuz. It put people into space, but it had to starve the economy to do it. That is not the right way of doing it. So I say Germany is key, because Germany has the key industries that need to be digitized, where the value needs to be protected. And I think whatever government or combination will be the result of the elections, the direction will not change, which is a good thing, because that means the administrations can start working together.
I'm going to get to Cam, because I know he has his hand up and I think he wants to respond to this directly, and then go to Sergey. It sounds like we've got a little bit of, let's say, political certainty, consistency going across into the post-Merkel era, which is a good thing. The question is, what is that certainty? And we have evidence from Gaia-X, this quest for digital sovereignty, the speech from Macron on the one hand. We have the push for liberating industrial data, public services data as a public good, and making sure that this economy in Germany, where we're sitting, is viable. And then, of course, we have Erich's assertion, which I think is useful, that it's going to be difficult for the US and Europe to do this alone. Cam, I know you want to come in, and then we're going to go to Sergey.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I think on digital sovereignty, I think it's rhetorically unfortunate because the term sounds an awful lot like what China promotes as cyber sovereignty. You know, I've been to their Wuhan International, I mean their Wuzhen International Global Internet Summit. And that is sort of front and center in their vision of the internet. And there are certainly overtones of a separate European internet when you get the sort of hard data localization requirements, such as the CNIL has proposed for a health data hub, or soft data localization. But if it is a thing like a digital commons and improved data sharing at a European level, I think those are things that are valuable, important. And I think the notion of strategic autonomy, I get. So. An appropriate reaction to what's happened in the last 4 years, and part of a mature partnership.
We're definitely going to come back to some of these questions around China in the second round, especially when we're talking about export controls and telcos, 5G, the geopolitics of 5G. But before we go there, Sergey, one of the things that Biden has really put front and center on his agenda is the idea of democracies working together. And he has said he wants to hold a summit of democracies, I believe somewhat inspired by some work that he's done with Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO, bringing together democracies to basically reaffirm their vows to their values and the rights of their citizens. How do you see this playing out? Is there a digital component that should be there? What do you see as the potential for work between the US and EU on digital rights?
Oh, thanks. Great being here. Thank you for inviting me. As you probably know, and many people know, and there were some mentions there in the chat, there is a kind of this idea of alliance of digital alliance of democracies in the digital realm and digital policies. And this is, of course, something very interesting and quite, it sounds very innovative. The question is how we're going to fill it in with life and with projects, and how can we construct it not as being kind of a camp of several allies against the rest of the world. I think this is an important point, that this should not be kind of a new monopoly, a camp of friends versus the rest. And we can discuss, what kind of design this can be. Should this be a real agreement, or should this be rather a network of a like-minded kind of strategical team of like-minded states? But generally, I think the two components that are going to be, they can enrich the agenda, but they can also, as much as I support them, they can also, and they will bring tensions to the questions of innovation, to the questions of free market, et cetera, and trade that we're talking about. And these two questions are rights and basic rights, human rights, rule of law on the one hand, and environment, especially climate, something that we don't talk about. What is the green balance of the Commission is going to present their data market strategy tomorrow. We're discussing the issue. In fact, today I made some amendments to our proposal in the Legal Affairs Committee on our positions on that. And something that is missing is the kind of the green balancing of data flows. I think it's important to talk about the environmental footprint of it, and at least to have it in mind. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do this. It means we should be mindful of that as well. But generally, the points where I think we will have to work together is the point of privacy, which already was mentioned, and I don't think I need to point it out. Is the point of hate speech versus free speech. I think this is something where, interestingly, the United States is moving more to the position of the European Union, but where we should be careful not to overregulate free speech. And I'm saying this as a Green. I'm myself and a little bit more on the libertarian side when it comes to the free speech and the chances of internet and the space of internet for minorities, for opposition leaders, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm seeing is there is kind of a fascination about filters and about regulations on what can be said in the internet. We will have to talk about that and where we meet transatlantically. And then the two or three other points is, what about mass surveillance? Do we want to set standards in terms of mass surveillance? And also something that we are talking about in the European Union about the moratorium or ban of facial recognition en masse. Something where Vestager is actually talking about moratorium, but when we start kind of breaking this down, what does that mean in terms of technology, in terms of regulation? There are still very many open questions on that. Something that is important for me and something that I advocate is an international ban of invasive social scoring. I think this is something where we should be watching carefully because it's an infectious thing. what we see in China also in terms of technologies, and social scoring is of course important as a concept, but it can be quite invasive and it can be quite expensive. And the point number 3, where I think it has also something to do with the technology and rights, is innovation in terms of open source, in terms of accessibility to both data and technology. Something that Erich Clementi mentioned as well, something that we're talking about in Germany, also how to make as much data as possible accessible to smaller players, on how to design a market that would be open also to other stakeholders and to small and medium enterprises. So this is kind of like the menu that we will have to be dealing with in the upcoming months. And I think that a lot of that is about transatlantic views and cooperation. And I don't think we will meet on all those questions, because even without Trump, we might kind of rediscover our common values with this administration. But I'm not sure how much we will be aligned on our common interests and on our kind of systemic style of talking about privacy, for example, or freedom of speech for that matter. So I think we will still be having a lot of discussions, and those discussions will be, I think, even more difficult, even because we want to like and to be liked by the new administration. You know, this is kind of the new thing. You know, the new administration is kind of the sexy thing. We want to be, but I'm sure we will be disappointed, and the disappointment will be even more kind of hurtful on both sides. This is the risk that I'm seeing.
Sergey, I think it's mutual.
we got to be careful with that expectations management, always key. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sergey. You know, there's a lot of convergence that we're seeing here, but you know, it's not going to align one for one. I mean, I see that in the group, in the audience, we have Ed Chow, for example, who was the author of the California data protection law. We see a lot of convergence on both sides of the Atlantic on a lot of these questions, but it's not exactly the same. So the petty differences are going to play a big role. Maybe we can turn a little global right now. Cam, I'm going to turn to you. This administration has been, the Trump administration has been kind of defined by its pursuit of technological decoupling from China, and has made some real, let's say, strong moves on import bans, export restrictions, use of CFIUS, et cetera, particularly as it regards 5G technology from Huawei and CTE. It also has obviously signed into law this this ban on social media apps, which is in the process of maybe being implemented or maybe not. Do you see a continuation of this kind of policy under a Biden administration? Where do you see differences vis-a-vis the tech relationship with China?
Well, you know, let me say at the outset that in I think it was 2011, I made the decision at the Commerce Department to keep Huawei and ZTE out of interoperability testing for U.S. public safety networks. And you know, I pretty deeply read in on the intelligence. You know, it was not clear then that they were that there were backdoors or that they were agents of the Chinese government. But I think there were a couple of things that made that decision an easy one. One is the sense that if asked by the Chinese government, that those companies would respond and sort of providing access. And given the policies in China since that time, the national security legislation, the increased state control, even of non-state enterprises, that is only more more credible. And the other part that made it easy was just the sense of reciprocity, that similar access to Chinese networks was denied to American companies. And I think again, those things have only increased. And I think there is a significant consensus on China, and I think that extends to Europe as well. President von der Leyen's speech last week talked about the need to deal with an illiberal China, that China should not be setting rules and standards in the technology world. So I think I'm sure there's the same degree of consensus within the EU, but there are certainly in the conversations I've had significant and growing concerns about these issues. So I don't, there's not going to be any kind of U-turn, I think, from the Obama administration. But by the same token, I think this administration will be clear that this is not about decoupling as such or keeping China down. This is about specific policies, specific behavior, and we'll deal with those, and we'll look to cooperate in important areas. The administration has made clear that pandemic response, climate change are at the top of its priorities. Those are issues where China can be an important partner, and I think there'll be efforts to build up that partnership as well. So, to make this more transactional than about a sort of strategic beating down of China.
We are, just to the audience, we've got about 60 folks with us. We're about to open it up to Q&A. I'm going to ask a couple of brief questions to Diane, Sergey, and Erich, but then we want to get you guys involved in questions and comments if you want. Just raise your blue hand and we'll make sure we call on you. Diane, I want to take up this point on the technological decoupling. I mean, clearly this is going to be a legacy of the Trump administration, redefining, resetting the relationship with China on more competitive or even adversarial terms. The Trump administration is still in power. And what are you hearing from your colleagues as we round the end of this period? Are there any ideas in the lame duck of other policy initiatives that they would like to take in order to cement this kind of decoupling relationship with China?
I think you'll see in Congress that there will be little action between now and next term. If there is action, I do see it happening more on the administration level through the entity list. Now, the entity list, which is run out of the Department of Commerce through BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Securities, is if a foreign company is placed on the entity list, which the administration can do without congressional approval, then an American company would need to obtain a waiver or a license they would have to apply for in order to sell to that company. So that is external facing. As you probably know, there was an executive order issued in May of 2019 that would give the Secretary of Commerce IEPA authority, Emergency Powers Authority, to make determinations on what is included in our ICTS, our Information Communications and Technologies within the United States. So that's more internal facing. Now, these regulations have been in the process since the executive order was issued back in May. They released a draft in November of last year. Industry came out strongly against it, concerns that it was too broad. While IEPA is not a new authority, how it's being used is a new tool for the US government. I think you can see this as a good sign that they've gone back to the drawing board, that they are taking industry input, because you want to ensure that this is done with a surgical tool as opposed to a sledgehammer. You want thoughtful decisions to come out of the administration when you're impacting business. So whether that is pushed out the door at the last minute, I don't have any inside information on that. But I will say that, I do think it's a positive step that this has been a robust interagency process through Commerce, through Justice Department, through the Treasury Department, to ensure that this is written tight enough where businesses can interpret how this is going to play out.
All right. I'm sure that is perhaps music to Erich's ears, being a former private sector leader. And I know that there were a lot of concerns from the private sector about the broadness, as you mentioned, in some of these rules. Yeah. Erich, maybe turning back to Europe a little bit, we're coming out with recovery packages. The EU has its European next generation package, which is focused, at least, what is it, a third of the big COVID recovery is focused on digitization writ large. Member states are also coming out with stimulus packages. To what extent do you see potential for a new industrial policy in Europe to make it able to run faster in some of these emerging technologies? And what do you think is the potential for working with the Biden administration on these efforts?
So first, the context of decoupling is a real risk, in the sense, if not managed carefully, there is collateral damage. Okay, so the nightmare scenario for me in my role as a European American executive was that the EU would, for one reason or another, say, exclude or confine the amount of business that we could be doing, or the area of business that we could be doing, and vice versa, frankly. Because the economics in the IT industry are such that you need scale or you are not competitive. Now, Europe is setting up an enormous amount of money along what Thierry Breton has articulated as control over data and cloud, CPU, processor architecture, high performance computing and fabrication, and third, what he calls communication, which is 5G and quantum internet communication. And I see these as necessary steps because obviously a vibrant digital industry is fundamental for Europe. First, because they need to move their existing industries into digitalization, and they need to protect against hollowing out through the platforms. So I understand the industrial logic first. Europe is different. I mean, it has a different structure, more small and medium enterprises. So Europe needs an autonomous model. So in that sense, that works fine. What I see though is too little discussion around what the two administrations, so let's say EU and US, could do together. Let me take 5G and Huawei, because the two things are connected. Initially, for those of you who followed the news, there was somewhere there was a blip when I think it was Attorney General Barr that said, why don't we simply buy Nokia or Ericsson, or we buy into Nokia and Ericsson and we build up a champion. I think with knowing what is going on in 5G, the whole industry is moving to a software-based approach. Software-based approach on standard hardware. The only thing in 5G that for the time being is not software is the antenna. But the whole rest of the stack can move to software. If Europe and the US move that industry to software, you can move it to open source and you solve the security issue. This is a solvable problem. This is a problem of agreeing standards together, and it would create an enormous amount of trust. What it would mean is that Ericsson and Nokia, but Huawei also, need to break up their vertical stacks for the technologists in the area, which means give transparency to the horizontal layers, and the problem is solved. Similarly, in August or in July, the US Department of Energy announced the start of quantum internet communications for a secure internet in 10 years. For the for person coming from business, what sense does it make to have a secure internet at US level and a different one at European level? Secure is secure. If we can raise security, there is potential to work together. Similarly, Gaia X, which addresses the European concerns about data usage. Gaia X should be supported by the hyperscalers actively in the US. Why? Because it makes it commercially viable and it addresses a legitimate concern. So maybe because I'm straddling two continents, even in my career, I say there is sufficient meat where the two administrations could work together. Standards was mentioned by Cameron Kerry. Standards are fundamental. If you allow spreading of the Belt and Road Initiative with smart cities and where there is no standard yet for safe cities, as the Chinese call it, you will have those standards creeping into the marketplace. So Tyson, I'm all for collaboration because it helps both sides. We just need to solve those issues around trust, around data, the Cloud Act, the entities list, and some predictable framework in which everybody can plan.
I mean, that sounds like a perfect call to throw to Sergey. Here's the call from private sector European Americans saying, we can work on open standards, cooperation, multi-stakeholder formats, try to close off or deal with extraterritoriality in areas like the Cloud Act, securitization, these kind of things. How is that perceived in the European Parliament? What do you think? Is the European Parliament thinking right now, yes, this is the approach we want to take. We want to work with the United States to forge standards that work for both of us and kind of think of this in terms of democratic autonomy as opposed to strategic autonomy?
I think how we see it for now is a step-by-step approach, case-by-case approach. I'm not sure this is the right way of doing it. I'm just describing the status quo. The European level is reckoning with the idea. I mean, to be honest, I think that the European regulatory level is a bit overwhelmed by the task. Yeah, it's just too large to grasp, to understand, to conceptualize, and still they are ahead of our American friends, I would say, in terms of regulating and thinking about regulations of those issues, because Europe is always ahead of the United States in terms of regulations, especially over regulations, I understand. But I think that we are a little bit, there is actually a concept that says, for example, in the area of artificial intelligence, we should not overregulate. We don't need special regulations for artificial intelligence. We have enough regular laws for artificial intelligence. I am not sure about that. And I do not belong to those who are also in the commission who say we should regulate very kind of case by case. So we had, for example, a regulation on liability, civil liability of artificial intelligence. Yeah, something that, the proverbial car which drives someone over and kills or injures someone, who is responsible? And this is, of course, the most simplistic way of looking at it. So that's when we looked at this specific thing. But what I'm lacking, or the ethical aspects, which was kind of a more overarching thing. But I'm not sure that we will be able to set standards if we don't address issues like, for example, bias and anti-discrimination issues, something which is linked very closely to the mutual trust and to the trust of consumers to the new technology. Very often we are being, you know, they say to us, oh, don't worry, well, there is normal anti-discrimination regulations, they're going to cover it. There is nothing new about this. I think there are many things new about this. And if we don't start talking about them without over-regulating, I understand this, we will not be able to talk to our transatlantic partners because we wouldn't be able to say what we're talking about, right? I mean, if we don't set standards in those areas, then we cannot talk about setting the same standards, similar standards. There is one other problem that I see is that people look at GDPR and say, well, this is the kind of the golden standard for us. Europe decided to go for it alone, and it went for it alone. And look at this, the world is trembling, and everyone wants our standards. Well, I don't think this is going to work in the area of artificial intelligence because this is a totally different case, right? I mean, the big giant tech companies wanted our market in terms of social networks, etc. We had something to offer. In terms of artificial intelligence, there is no mutual dependence that we have in the case of data protection and data use. So we would need, and there I come back to Erich, a point. We would only work on this and we would only be able to set standards if we do it together in this area, like artificial intelligence and like the data flows and data common market. So I see still some work and some convincing to be done in Brussels, both in terms of what we mean by sovereignty. That sovereignty will not mean that we have an island Europe, because sovereignty is also double-faced, right? I mean, sovereignty doesn't mean sovereignty vis-a-vis China. Sovereignty also means sovereignty vis-a-vis United States. And those fears are also well-founded after the Snowden revelations. I mean, this was a pivotal, this was a very important traumatic experience for everyone, all the tech freaks and the tech data freaks in Europe. We don't trust United States technological technologies and technological policies in this area. So we would need to create more trust, mutual trust on that, and we would need to have a more sobriety and more realistic understanding that we can only join forces, and only by joining forces we will be able to set standards globally.
Well, thank you so much, Sergey. We have 7 minutes time for questions, and the first question comes from Wolfgang Kleinwaechter. Wolfgang, if you can just go ahead and unmute yourself, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Tyson. Good discussion. You know, my critical take from the Clean Network Initiative of the Trump administration was that it put Europe in a difficult situation to become sandwiched between China and the US. And what Erich said here, decoupling has collateral damages and will create some problems. So what we see now with new proposals is that we will have probably a two-layer system. Erich mentioned also internet fragmentation. And what I see is the internet was from the very early day a network of networks, fragmented in a number of different networks. And you have networks which are interlinked by technical protocols, and then you have networks linked by political values. And so what you think about the proposal Derek Cohen made in the Foreign Affairs about a T12 that needs to build within the global internet a special, let's say, sub-network of like-minded countries. He includes to the G7 countries like Israel, Sweden, Finland with Nokia Ericsson, Australia, Japan, and Taiwan. You know, and so that we have a double strategy. On the one hand is to continue global cooperation based on the roadmap proposed by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And then like an inner circle where you strengthen the cooperation on more or less equal level or mutual respect among the like-minded countries. So this would be two layers in the system. Back to you, Tyson. Thank you.
So it's a great question. So informal, working together on the technical side, the values side, in informal groupings. Cam, do you see this as a model for a Biden administration to think about resetting tech governance?
Yes, I do. I do think, as the questioner, as Sergey Lagodinsky mentioned, that we need, that we need to focus on like-minded countries. I think a T12 may be too static and not inclusive enough. But I do think that a pivotal piece of this is the U.S. and the EU working in partnership. That partnership comprises over 1/3 of GDP, and that by itself builds critical mass. But it needs to work outwards from there to include, other T12, other OECD countries, and other regions of the world. This cannot be, purely a sort of Western, Western imposition on the rest of the world. But so, it's a building process. I think an important element of that is what's been talked about here, is to find some opportunities to cooperate in the technology area. I think artificial intelligence, presents an enormous opportunity to do that. We have pressing problems, enormous potential with AI. I think we can work through a lot of these issues by, taking some grand challenges in AI and working together on those.
Diane has a comment, and maybe we can even take this as an opportunity to go Diane, Erich, and then Sergey to do kind of a wrap up, because we got about 2 minutes.
Great, thanks, Tyson. So I also serve as the executive director of the Open RAN Policy Coalition. It's a coalition of 57 global companies that span not only the globe, but the mobile ecosystem, all coming together to have a conversation. How can we ensure a more robust and diverse supply chain? So kind of the 3 pillars that we focus on, and I believe the most important is international coordination and collaboration. When we launched this organization just back in May, not too long ago, we never expected it to resonate as much as it has. And we've spent a significant amount of time talking to global policymakers around the world. And everyone has the same question, like, what organization can we go to continue this conversation? It's not just the United States. We cannot bring the concept of Open RAN to scale. We really need to be able to share information, to share best practices in order to ensure that robust supply chain that everyone is looking forward to as we build out 5G, and especially in the developing nations around the world. So I agree with you that we need to come together and have a place where we can have this conversation.
Thank you for bringing that up. Open RAN was exactly what I was thinking of when Erich was making his comment a second ago. Erich, you're up.
So as I stated before, I see a ton of opportunity for collaboration. There is a history of collaboration on large projects, on large standard setting, industry transforming projects. We don't need to talk about the space station or similar projects, but there are. And serendipity is that in the industry transformation, 5G is one of those, but the quantum internet is one of those. Dealing with data, so the layers that we create to make different business models around data possible, that is a problem that Europe feels more strongly than the US right now, but it is a problem that the US has to tackle too, unless you want everything to be sucked up into Google and into Amazon. So I think the more there is commonality and interoperability, the better it will be for everybody, not just for the EU and the US. By the way, the one framework that I found interesting to read, even if it's just very short, was the US National Strategy for Critical and Emerging Technologies that was released on October 20th by the current administration. I mean, it's fairly neutral, but it talks about technologies where the US wants to lead, technologies where they want to be a technology peer, and technologies where we agree on how to risk manage. And I think a common understanding of these three groups will allow the markets not to be cut down too much, so not to defragment too much and still be economically viable, but while at the same time securing the understandable needs around privacy and the rest that the countries have. That's an optimist view, Tyson. All right.
Thanks, Erich. And the fact that the administration could produce a 5-page pamphlet, which I think 2 pages of it were basically the cover and the conclusion, or like the back page, is pretty extraordinary. I wonder if the commission could do something like that. Sergey, give you the final word. What do you see as, maybe just looking out? We got 3 months until the new administration's in office. What should we be doing? What are your final outlooks?
The easiest questions to me. Yeah, I think we should just start talking, and I think by discussing things and putting things on the table, it would already be a huge step forward, because I do think that we have more values that align us, and kind of the way of doing things is less transactionist and more setting a value kind of system of coordinates. I do think we should be careful about those kind of the internet decoupling strategies, what Wolfgang Kleinwaechter mentioned. I also, read there is this Robert Knake proposal, which basically the starting point is we cannot be both global and free. So we should start talking about local and free, to put it. I'm not sure whether this would whether we are giving up too soon. I think it is important to see that there are 2 layers. One is the cooperation. And this, I totally agree. There is this proposal of T10. I don't know if the T12, who the 2 are going to be in addition, but there is a T10 a proposal in terms of informal cooperation, semiconductor, the whole security of supply chain, etc. I think this is fine, but when we start talking about weaponizing it, as it is being done by the Council of Foreign Relations, we shouldn't be, too weaponizing in our language either. I do think resilience is an important point. Security is an important point, but let's try to keep the internet as possible and as free for as many people as possible. Don't forget about, the civil societies in Russia, China, India. We also have a responsibility to fight for their free access and their free rights. Not just thinking about our free rights and free access. So this is kind of like a global and maybe very abstract answer to the question that Wolfgang Kleinwaechter pointed, but kind of as a main direction. Let's not become too much inwards looking and self-righteousness and kind of carried out by self-righteousness. But let's try to keep our world together, but find ways of setting standards for the whole world and not for just a little cluster of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Sergey. And thanks to all of you, Diane, Kim, and Erich. This has been a great discussion. It's been very wide-ranging, but that's what we wanted and we expected. I think we put a lot of items on the agenda, the priority list. It's going to be quite the list for the new administration coming into office on January 20th. But my big takeaway is we still want to preserve an internet whole, secure, and free, kind of a 21st century recalibration of the Europe whole, free, and at peace. And that's going to take partnerships, and it's going to take partnerships beyond states. And it's going to include partners in countries that sometimes whose governments we find distasteful. I want to thank you guys all, and thank you for the audience who is here. We are going to be taking up many of these issues at DGAP in the next months, more drill down in some of these issues, from quantum computing to 5G to open standards, IP, internet governance, etc. And we want you all to be with us. So stay tuned and we'll be in touch.